Welcome to Encounter, where we celebrate putting faith into action and community leaders who live out compassion, grace, and love. We're a program of the Broome County Council of Churches that addresses food insecurity through CHOW and the Greater Good Grocery, provides hospital and jail ministry, builds wheelchair ramps, and assists neighbors with transportation and shopping services through Faith in Action volunteers. We invite you to the conversation. Encounter your neighbors as we learn to walk together in love and kindness.
Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Encounter. I'm your host, Jeff Kellam, one of the co-hosts for Encounter each week. Back in my prime, and it was some time ago, I was the associate pastor of a suburban church in Richmond, Virginia, a pretty large church, and I was there every Sunday morning leading worship or preaching once a month. At the same time, however, I was on the radio doing the B103 Jazz Brunch. So I was live in the church, I was on tape on the radio. And I remarked to a colleague of mine in ministry that I felt a little bit guilty entertaining people when they should have been in church. He said, you know, I go to early church, then I go home and I listen to the Jazz Brunch. And he said, I find it spiritually enriching. He said, it calms me down or it brings me joy. He said, it speaks to my heart. He said, I just love that music, and it speaks to my spiritual life. I thought, jazz and the spiritual life. Now here we are all these years later, and I have a book called Thriving on a Riff, and look, jazz and the spiritual life. And the author of the book is here, right here in the studio. My friend Bill Carter is the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Clark Summit, Pennsylvania. You are the founder, composer, pianist for the Presby Bop Jazz Quintet, Quartet, Sextet, whatever.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, Bill, you've been on the program before, and your music has been on Encounter before because I've often used it at Christmas.
Okay.
We did a video of a Christmas concert at a church and played about a half hour of that. So, you're no stranger to the Encounter crowd. Everybody knows probably you play jazz piano. Tell me, let's just begin, before we talk about your book, because we will talk about your book, just begin with, you were headed toward ministry, were you already when you discovered jazz? Or did
No. I was a jazz musician in high school, Owego Free Academy, and was playing on weekends with my band teacher, my music teacher, John Harper. Went off to Binghamton University, back when it was merely called Harper College, and played with the great Al Hom. And at the time, I was a pre-med major, which was ill-advised. It was my own decision. I don't know where it came from. It just bubbled out like a belch. And I figured I needed to honor it and go pursue pre-med. A calculus-based physics class, I like to say, is where I found God, or God found me and said, get out of this.
Right.
And I immediately went across campus and talked to Al Hom and said, I need to drop this class. I'm not doing well. This is my sophomore year. And he said, well, write some big band arrangements for me. And I did that as an independent study. So that was one component.
Right.
At the same time, I was having these spiritual moments, quite rare as a Presbyterian, and felt maybe I was beckoned toward or invited toward pursuing ministry, and which would involve another 3 years in a master's program. And I just felt like they were two different worlds. They didn't overlap much for me. And I thought I was going to leave behind jazz piano, which when I graduated in the early 80s, I was playing 5 or 6 nights a week. And I gave that up when I went to Princeton to go to seminary. And then in the providence of God, it kept bubbling back. Sometimes on campus, I would play the faculty Christmas party and be sitting over in the corner kind of noodling on Christmas carols. And all these eminent theologians are walking around eating crumpets and sipping wine, and it was kind of a gas.
Yeah.
The seminary had a speech studio that did productions. We did a Thurber Carnival based on the on the short stories of James Thurber, which had a jazz soundtrack. They kind of selected that because they knew they had me. But then I thought it would go back on the shelf. The difference came when I felt I needed to relocate, and I moved to a church in Clark Summit, where I still am. And the very day, you know, the way we do it as Presbyterians, you preach a sermon and they vote on you.
Yeah.
So I did that. They voted yes. And a guy stood up in the back of the church and said, "We heard you preach, and that was just fine. Play something on the piano." And I said, "Well, that's not why I'm here."
But he knew what your background was.
He knew.
Yeah.
He knew. And I said, "That's not why I'm here." He said, "That's what you think." So I stomped out a 4/4 version of Amazing Grace, improvised a little bit. But I said, I'm really there because they had a great music program in place, and I'm just going to be the minister, the preacher. And then it kept bubbling up until one summer we could not find a substitute organist. And our saintly organist said, "Why don't you play?" And it was going to be for Labor Day weekend. And I said, "Not a bad choice of dates. No one's going to be there. They'll be at the lake or the mountains."
Yeah.
And sure. And then she smiled and said, "Are you going to jazz up the hymns?" And we've been doing that every Labor Day ever since.
And how many years has that been?
Oh, come on now. It's over 30 years.
Yeah.
Over 30 years.
So it's stuck, and you have a reputation not only in your local church for playing jazz, but the Presby Bop jazz idea came to you, and you worked with Al Hom, you worked with a couple of wonderful drummers who played with, Tom Whaley played with Mose Allison.
Right.
And
Ron Vincent played with Jerry Mulligan.
Yeah. So we then leap forward, and I'm going to hold this book up. It's called Thriving on a Riff. And so this is kind of the culmination of a lot of thinking that you've been doing, a lot of research, a lot of the stories that you've told as you play your concerts. So then you wanted to put it into print.
That's right. I've been thinking about it for a while. I received a grant from the Louisville Institute in Louisville Seminary in Kentucky, and was going to take the summer of 2020 to write the book. Of course, the pandemic hit, and I didn't want to take any time away from the church during that. They needed me, I needed them. But I did go in 2021 and spent the entire summer working on it. Was able to connect with a developmental editor. I didn't know what that was, and she said, "Well, you write the book you want to write, and then I'll make it a book that people will want to read." And then my cousin John has a son who is a copy editor in Western Pennsylvania, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to keep it in the family, and so I lined him up to go through and make sure that the verbs were correct, that the footnotes were in the right format, that it would be ready to send off literally to a printer. And all of that, of course, is done electronically now. You just push the send button and off it goes.
Yeah. And we're not talking about a self-published book either. This is a book from Broadleaf, an imprint of 1517 Media.
Yeah.
Some people know it as Fortress Press.
1517 as in Martin Luther, so it's the old Lutheran press, and so it's all of the Lutheran presses now combined under an umbrella.
Right.
This is kind of the pop version, the pop line. They're trying very hard to produce products, podcasts, and magazines and books that reach out to the people who might faintly remember religion or wouldn't want to darken the door, but they sense there's something afoot, mystical, spiritual in the world, and they want to find out more.
Yeah.
And also a line of books that's very concerned about justice and confronting racism and telling the truth about the fullness of life.
And certainly, looking at the table of contents, you get a sense that this is a book about music, about the spiritual life. It's also a book that looks at some of the darker sides of jazz.
Oh, yeah.
mental illness, addiction, racism. Where did these stories come from?
Well, from research, from the backs of LPs, from jazz history. I have a very large collection of musicians' biographies and books about the history. A couple of stories came from the Ken Burns special over 20 years ago now on PBS. There's a whole kind of lore and mystical lore about jazz, which is a music that a lot of people do not understand, even though it was America's popular music pretty much from the mid-20s until the late 30s.
Yeah. Certainly, it was the music I grew up with because my parents were of the World War II era, and the first 78 RPM records my mother would play when I was a little kid were the leftover tunes from her teens, and these were the big bands.
Right.
And that got me into that kind of music. A little side thing here. I know that not everybody likes jazz. People will say, I don't like jazz. And so you think, well, okay, you don't like Diana Krall? Of course you like Diana Krall. And then there's, it's against the microphone. I'm making all kinds of things here.
I'll help you.
We have then Ella Fitzgerald and Harry Connick Jr., very popular, jazz.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
And then Count Basie, you like big band stuff? Jazz. And look, too much light. Okay. Vince Guaraldi and the Peanuts TV shows.
Yep.
It's a jazz soundtrack. You don't like jazz? And then if you're into the harder stuff, then of course there's the Miles Davis thing.
That's classic albums, all of them.
Yeah, and so jazz has all these different kinds of genres within it.
Right.
But let's leave that behind for a moment and look at the thriving on a riff, some of the jazz vocabulary. Mm-hmm. What does thriving on a riff mean? That's the title of the book.
Title of the book, it's the title of a contrafact composed by Charlie Parker.
A contrafact. Now,
contrafact.
Would that be a tune based on someone else's?
Yep, yep. The way it works is you copyright melodies, but you don't necessarily copyright chord progressions. And one of the prevailing chord progressions in jazz history has been, I've got rhythm. Mm-hmm. So Charlie Parker, great saxophonist, wrote this piece, Thriving on a Riff, played it with Dizzy Gillespie, the trumpeter, recorded it, and I thought that is exactly what I want to talk about because it has to do with thriving, human thriving, spiritual thriving, on a riff, another jazz phrase. A riff is a repeated phrase, like in the mood. Ba-ba-doop-doo-ba-da-ba-dee-ba-doo-bop.
Yeah.
Ba-ba-doop-doo-ba-da-ba-doo. You know, it's a repeated phrase,
right.
And it adds some buoyancy. The chords underneath it, the architecture, harmonic architecture might change, so the riff might change a little bit, but it's this memorable, recurring phrase, musical phrase.
Yeah.
So I thought, this is kind of it. And, you know, one of the origin stories, and I didn't realize this earlier in my life, came from my mother. For her 19th birthday in Western Pennsylvania, she was invited to a Louis Armstrong concert. It was on a Thursday night, which suggests that Louis was passing through, probably from major cities.
He'd do the big gigs on the weekends.
Right, yeah. And he's in Oil City, Pennsylvania, in the Latonia Theater. Place is jammed, and my mom says she remembers two things. One was, within a minute or two, Armstrong's completely immersed in the music, so much so that he's perspiring profusely, and he would reach over on the piano and grab a handkerchief and wipe his brow and toss it down, and do it again. A couple minutes later, had a stack of handkerchiefs, and I thought, what that DNA would be worth.
Right, for the hankies.
That's right. And the second thing she said is the room changed. And I said, what do you mean the room changed? She said, we all were kind of lifted. And I thought, that's what I want to write about. And she said, well, wait a second. And she went over to a scrapbook, she opened it up, and she pulled out the $1.85 ticket from 1955,
Right.
which I now have framed.
Yeah.
But I began to mull that over and do some more research on the Armstrong and that part of history. 1955, Emmett Till was murdered. Brown versus the school board. Racial matters were rearing up, and some were trying to squelch any kind of confrontation of the racism. It was a Thursday night in western Pennsylvania. I think it might have been, at least informally, a sundown town, meaning Armstrong, as an African American, would not be allowed to rent a hotel room there.
Sure. Yeah.
He had a band of mixed racial backgrounds, black and white, all suspicious in some parts of America at that time. And yet he came out and he played and immersed himself in this music, and everybody was lifted.
And that means everybody, young and old,
everybody,
black and white, though there probably weren't too many African Americans in the audience in Oil City.
No, I don't think so. And it was kind of remarkable what was happening on that stage and how it pervaded. And I'm sure they were talking about this the next day, the 1,800 people who were there.
Yeah.
And it's kind of stunning to realize he couldn't spend the night in a place, and yet he would come in. And during that time of his touring, his biographer said he regularly would be singing and playing a Fats Waller tune. Why am I so black and blue? So his music was actually confronting the racism, naming it,
yeah,
expressing his opinion about it, pushing up against it, and doing this in a way that people were engaged in the rhythm, and then they hear the words seeping in later on.
There's that Billie Holiday story, too.
Oh, Billie Holiday.
That song.
Who sang Strange Fruit, which is full of horrific imagery about lynching.
Yeah.
And at the height of her career, that was the last song she would sing every night, and then the lights would cut into darkness and she'd slip off the stage. And Harry Anslinger, who was the government agent who was opposed to drugs and alcohol, was trying to get her to stop singing that song, doing anything he could, because it was too honest, too truthful, and at some extent, the nation wasn't ready yet to address its own racism.
Yeah. One other story I remember from the book is Eugene Wright, the bass player for Dave Brubeck, that when they toured the South, they wanted him to stay behind a curtain?
Behind a curtain. Yeah. Well, and Brubeck had hired him to go, first of all, across the ocean on a State Department tour. They were going to spend months out playing jazz behind the Iron Curtain and in Asia, places where the State Department thought, these are risky places, we'd like to model American culture, particularly American justice and imagination. And so Dave hired Eugene at the last minute.
Yeah. African American.
And the night before they left on the tour was Gene's first night, and they were down in one of the Carolinas at the college, and they walked on the stage, and there was a near riot among the faculty and administration. We can't let this go on.
Wow.
But the students had hired the Brubeck Quartet. And when Dave came back to the States months later, he ended up canceling over 20 concerts in the South because they wanted Wright to play behind the curtain.
Yeah. So these are some of the stories in the book, Thriving on a Riff. Moving to the lighter side,
sure.
When we think about how jazz touches the spirit and creates joy, I mean, there's a lot. That's rhythm, improvisation, and so on. But tell me about some of the other aspects of the spiritual life that are touched by the emotion and the heart of jazz.
Well, creativity is the first one. and that human mystery of how things emerge, where they come from. So I actually put that in 2 chapters. One is about divine creativity, and the other is about human creativity. And there is, of course, a dotted line between them. Divinely, I begin by telling the story of Dave Brubeck was invited to write a mass for the 1987 papal mass in Candlestick Park, San Francisco. First American mass with the Pope.
Right.
And he said, I'm really not worthy of this. Went to sleep, dreamed the whole thing, called up the next day through his manager and said, I'll reconsider. I got a message from headquarters. So it's kind of an entree of thinking about, we talk about jazz as creative music. Well, let's speak of the creator who is still creating. The creation is not finished.
Yeah.
And then human creativity, I tell the story of Keith Jarrett. After riding for a full day from Switzerland to Cologne, Germany, he's there for a concert in an opera house. And the opera house management has pushed this scheduling off until 11 o'clock at night. The concert's being promoted by a 17-year-old female, and with very little experience. And this all is beginning to happen, and Jarrett shows up and discovers that the piano is unplayable.
Yeah.
That someone, probably in the opera house staff, had switched pianos thinking that jazz wasn't worthy of the 9-foot Bosendorfer. They're going to get the little baby one,
right,
where the pedal's stuck. And so he was going to cancel the concert, and Vera Brandes, the 17-year-old promoter, said, you can't do this. We have a sellout crowd. Can't give the money back. Right. So she prevailed on him, and they worked on the piano, and he produced what became the best-selling jazz piano album ever, the Cologne Concert.
Yeah, right.
Completely improvised.
Yeah, yeah. So and when jazz musicians play, they never play the same tune the same way. There's that creativity that you can't help yourself,
That's right.
This is the improvisational part of it. And a lot of this I can see lots of parallels between jazz and the church and our ministry, improvisation and just to kind of...
Well, jazz pushes up against human control. And my sense of why a lot of jazz musicians fell out of favor with the church is they were confronted by the control impulses that most of us have. You've got to keep the service to 59 minutes.
Yeah.
You've got to do emphasis on behaviors. Don't drink, don't dance, don't chew, or date the girls that do. All these kind of moralistic imperatives that come from social control.
Yeah.
And the antithesis of freedom and creativity. And I wonder now in this day and age where a lot of my kind of churches have played out and that control has suffocated so much, what if we were to invite the Holy Spirit to come in, or to recognize when the Spirit comes in? And it starts very small with children speaking up. They're not going to follow the adult rules.
No.
Which is wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, I know. And when there are some folks who will complain about the noise of the children in the back of the church or something, and you think, this is the most wonderful sound that you could have.
That's right.
In a church that is struggling for existence sometimes. You're glad that there's a giggling voice in the back, or a kid running up and down.
Exactly. And I'm not an advocate for sloppiness, but a completely human experience.
Right.
Human. Someone said to me, so talk to me about spirituality. And I said, I don't know what spirituality is. It's an ality word. The only ality word I know is reality. And how is this a real moment?
Yeah.
Completely alive.
Authentic human, being fully alive.
Yeah.
You know, it's,
Yep.
it's the glory of God.
That's right. Saint Irenaeus used to say that.
Yeah.
And jazz, I think, is one of the portals into that kind of experience.
Yeah.
Now, should we scrap hymns? No. Can we have a little fun with hymns? Yes.
Yeah. Before we have about 3 minutes left, let's talk about, the book is not yet out, so it's
Right.
being released soon.
April 23rd, 2024. Available for pre-sale on all the Amazon and bookshop outlets, and probably, I would think, I know Barnes & Noble as well.
Yeah. And there'll be, tell me about the concert at your church, or a book signing in Clark Summit, which, you know.
April 21st, we were able to do a kind of a pre-release concert with books available. First Presbyterian, Clark Summit, 4 o'clock. And the special aspect of that is we're going to be performing with a sextet, and we're doing music that I wrote for Al Hom, so it's a memorial concert.
Right.
And also a couple of things he wrote that I played with him over and over and over again.
Yeah, yeah. And the band is made up of folks from northeastern Pennsylvania?
All over,
Yeah.
all over. We have 2 guys from Syracuse, Joe Corello on alto sax, and Jeff Stockham on trumpet and flugelhorn. A couple of folks from compatriots from down my way, Tom Hamilton on tenor sax and flute, and also Tony Marino on bass. And then the effervescent drummer, Ron Vincent, will come over from New York City.
Right, right. That's going to be really a great afternoon, not only to talk about the book, but to hear the music and
Right.
to think also about Al Hom and the impact he had on you personally,
Yes,
as your
very much
professor. And I understand you hired Al.
I did. I was the first student, maybe only student, to ever hire him. Back in the days when there was a campus pub at Binghamton University, before the drinking age went up.
Yeah.
We'd play on Thursday nights, I think it was, and he'd come down and play for $50.
Yeah. That's great. What a bargain.
What a bargain.
Yes, indeed. Our guest today on the Encounter program has been the Reverend Bill Carter, who is the author of Thriving on a Riff, Jazz and the Spiritual Life, which will be available in bookstores by the end of the month. You can pre-order it, of course. I'm Jeff Kellam. I do not have a book. I do have a radio show, though, called Classic Vital Jazz.
There you go.
And Bill and I do a podcast together called The Spirit of Jazz, available wherever podcasts are found. All right, with all that self-promotion, I can tell you the Encounter program is produced in cooperation with the Broome County Council of Churches, with thanks to WBNG TV. I always look up when I say that. It's because of the lights. And the Town Square media stations play it on the radio. We're grateful for that, too. I hope that in the coming week, you'll find yourself being gentle with people and with yourself. I'm Jeff Kellam, the Parish Associate at the Union Presbyterian Church in Endicott, hoping that you'll be with us again next week for Encounter.